Very happy to offer this program in partnership with the Aurora Human Relations Commission. So I want to invite Bertha up here to say a few words about our organization. Yeah, whatever you want.
Good evening. The Human Relations Commission of the City of Aurora seeks to create greater understanding and connections within our community and to preserve and recognize the rights of residents of Aurora and those who interact with our community, particularly in the areas of equal employment, housing, and access to public services and facilities. If you feel that you have been the victim of discrimination, the Commission is a local resource for you. You can learn more about how we can help, as well as submitting a complaint through our website at www.aurora-il.org/HRC. Additionally, if you are a member of a local community group working on issues related to our mission, we would welcome an opportunity to collaborate with you to help your members and further our work as a commission. Please do contact us to discuss how we can work with your group. This presentation is a part of our Fairness and Equality for a Better Aurora series of events. Past events included presentations on LGBTQ+ learning and resources, housing in the COVID-19 pandemic, and LGBTQ+ friendly business practices in a transgender panel discussion. Future events are currently being planned, and we hope to see you next year for more interesting topics. To stay in touch with the Commission and learn about our coming events, please do follow us on Facebook at Human Relations Commission Aurora IL. On behalf of our chairperson, William Small Jr., I'd like to thank the Aurora Public Library, and in particular, Krista Danis and Colleen Cullen for helping make this event and all the others happen. Have a great evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Bertha. Okay, so Professor Ramirez is here with us tonight. He's prepared a presentation. There are slides in Spanish available. I've also shared a link in the chat for people on Zoom. So I'll just go ahead and introduce you now, and I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect.
So Professor Ramirez is an associate professor of history at Elgin Community College, and he is the project director of the Chicagolandia Oral History Project. His research focuses on the history of Latinx suburbia, particularly in Aurora, Elgin, and Waukegan. Get that right?
Perfect. Yeah.
So thank you so much for being here. I'll go ahead and hand it over.
All right.
Okay, good evening, everybody. Thanks everybody in person for being here, and thanks everybody on Zoom. It's wonderful to see you all tonight. My name is Antonio Ramirez. As Colleen mentioned, I teach history. I teach political science at Elgin Community College. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself as well, but I'm going to cover some general kind of umbrella information and statistics about the growth of the Latinx community in Aurora. But also I'm going to dive into some specific historical moments that many of you may not be familiar with, because Latinx history has traditionally been left unwritten in the larger story of American history. There's a very well-known historian named Vicki Ruiz, who was the president of the American Historical Association, who said, and this was a bold statement when she made this statement, she said, Latino history is American history. When she said it at the time, it was a bold statement. I think as we move forward, we're understanding how true that in fact is. So I'm going to share my screen so you can hopefully see my presentation. I'm going to talk for about 30 minutes or so, and as this presentation is titled Co-Creating Latinx History, I would love to invite folks to share any stories that they might have, anything that no matter how small, no matter how large, that is inspired by anything you see in this presentation, or even something that's not inspired by what you see in this presentation. And part of the reason I want to encourage you to do that is because this is the necessary process of recuperating and building Latinx history, histories that, as I said, have been for a large part unwritten. So the presentation is called Chicagolandia, a history of Latinx people in Aurora, not the history of Latinx people in Aurora, a history, right? And I want to emphasize that because I'm a historian. I've read a lot of books. I've spent a lot of time in classes. I've taught a lot of courses, but I am, so I'm an expert in some sense, but I'm not the expert, right? When we're talking about history, history can be constructed and written down by people like me, like who get their learning from books and from courses and from other professors. But the most important history in my mind is history that comes from the ground up, that is based in community, right? And those histories are, they're always there, right? And part of, I think, the job of a historian, a good historian, is to connect what we know, which is limited, right, with what the knowledge that currently exists in the community. And that knowledge is rich, it is broad, and it is incredibly important. Okay? So real quickly, just about me. I think my wife is on this call. I don't think she knew that I was going to share a picture of her, but this is in the middle. My wife, Kate, and our sons, Emilio and Rigo. They're 5 and 2, and we live in Elgin. I'm also showing some pictures of Kate and I at an Indigenous Migrant Assembly in Mexico City that we participated in many years ago, and then some pictures of my extended family on the right-hand side. And I start my classes this way at ECC because it's always important for somebody who's telling a story to tell a little bit about who they are, right? We call this our subjectivity, right? Who you are really affects how you tell a story. So this is a little bit about who I am, and it does shape the story that I tell. I've got family from Mexico, from Zacatecas and Jalisco. I also have family from Southern Illinois, so I'm of Mexican and Irish and British descent on the different sides of my family. I grew up in Milwaukee. I was a high school social studies teacher, taught bilingual high school social studies there. As indicated in the pictures, my wife and I lived in Zacatecas. We lived in Mexico City. And since 2014, I've been teaching at ECC history and political science. But I think I've been invited here today because I just finished a PhD on the history of Latinos in the suburbs, right? So that includes Waukegan, Elgin, Aurora, and some of the smaller communities in between those places. So I do know a little bit about this growing community, and I'm going to share some of that with you. The other reason I know a little bit about this community is because since about 2015 or 2016, my students at Elgin Community College and I have been running the Chicagolandia Oral History Project, which is a project that collects the stories of Latino people living in the suburbs of Chicago, okay? And why do we focus on the suburbs? I'll talk about that.
Antonio, I think you can minimize that if you want. So we can, yeah, if you don't mind minimizing it. No, yeah, perfect. Thank you.
So in this project, we use oral history, which, as you can see from this photo, is really one person listening to another person, recording their stories, listening very humbly, trying to minimize their interventions in order to allow that person to really tell their story. Let me skip ahead a little bit here. Over the course of the past few years, we've collected a little over 30 interviews of community leaders, grandparents, parents, immigrants, US citizens, Latin American citizens, the stories of people of Mexican descent, Puerto Rican descent, Salvadoran descent, Chileans, Dominicans, Mexican Americans, Panamanians, lots of different types of people. So in collecting these stories and in doing some of the research that I've done, I've come to a few conclusions about the kind of makeup and the importance of Latino suburbia, as I call it. Chicagolandia is the term that I have used to refer to all these communities in around greater Chicago. So these are kind of the big ideas, and I have this cartoon here for a reason. Here's the few big ideas, conclusions that I've drawn. First of all, Latinx communities in suburban Chicago are nationally important. Right? In terms of the ways that Latino people have interacted with cities and suburbs and with the built environment, we have a very unique situation in the Chicago metropolitan area. I found, as many know, that Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, and other Latinos and Latinas have been in this region for a long time, for more than a century in some cases. Okay, so it's important to emphasize this because a lot of people think that Mexicans and Puerto Ricans are new arrivals to places like Aurora or even to the United States. Right? That's not true. I also want to emphasize that there is a history that is more recent in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, and 2000s that we do not have not yet generally recognized. But since the early 2000s, Chicago's Latinx population is in fact majority suburban. And now that we've actually just in the past few weeks gotten the census data from the 2020 census, we know that's even more true than it was before. And this is probably the most important, the last point is probably the most important determination that I've come to in this research, is that the labor of Latino people has sustained the economy of Greater Chicago since at least the metropolitan area suburbanized, started rapidly suburbanizing in the 1950s. So Latino labor, that's why I put this cartoon up here, has really sustained the economies of these places. So I want to show you a few charts and graphs and maps that really kind of emphasize how dramatic the growth of Latinx suburbia on the outskirts of Chicago has been in the last 50 and 60 years. So on the left-hand side here, you see a map of what was reported to the census in 1960. These are folks who were deemed quote unquote Spanish surnamed people in 1960. So you can see in Elgin, about 7% of the population was quote unquote Spanish surnamed. In Aurora, about 5%. West Chicago, 1% in 1960. Waukegan, about 8% within the city limits. In 2018, and we'll see even more dramatically when we have more complete data, that population has just exploded. Just absolutely exponential growth. We know that in the 1960s, the 1970s, Chicago suburbanized. What is less acknowledged is that in fact, Latino suburbia grew at rates that were much faster than the rest of suburban Chicago. So this is just a chart. You don't have to look real closely at the numbers, but you can tell the overall trend, especially since 1980, in Chicago suburbs like Aurora has been to grow pretty dramatically. The other thing I want to emphasize with the next chart here is that Chicagolandia, as I define it, so these large Latino majority or close to Latino majority places like Aurora have grown faster in terms of their Latino population than the city of Chicago, right? So when we're looking back since 1980, most Latinos have moved into Chicago suburbs, not the city of Chicago, okay? And we've also seen that in the last 10 years. Just recently, the 2020 census data was released, only partially released. I'm going to show you a few charts from the Latino Policy Forum that indicate, what has happened in the last 10 years in Latino suburbia. First of all, this chart shows the state of Illinois. In the light yellow bar is the percentage of Latino people living in the state of Illinois in 2010, and the darker bars are the percentage living in these places in 2020. Okay. Now, there's a lot of information here, but what I want you to notice is, first of all, Kane County has the highest percentage of any place in Illinois, including the city of Chicago, including Cook County, of Latinos. 1 in 3 people in Kane County is now Latino. And for people who were around Kane County in the 1960s and 70s, that might be kind of surprising that the most Latino place in Illinois is Kane County. And Aurora is one of the most Latino places in Kane County, right? So we're talking about important in terms of the state. Also, you'll notice that some of the most dramatic growth has not been in Chicago, has not been in Cook County, but in other suburban counties like Will, Lake, and McHenry. So again, this population is suburbanizing. Looked at a different way, we can see that the states with the highest numbers of growth in Latino populations are places like Illinois. So on the very left-hand side here, this is the state of Illinois. That red bar is the out-migration of white people from Illinois, and the brown bar is the in-migration of people of Latino descent from Illinois. So within 10 years, almost, the numbers are very close. The numbers of non-Latino people that have left the state are almost completely replaced by Latino people entering the state, right? So we often think, and this is the story about Chicago as well, is that people are fleeing Chicago. Well, some people are fleeing Chicago, some people are fleeing Illinois, other people are arriving, right? In almost the exact same number. Now let's drill down a little bit to talk about what we're here to hear a little bit more about is this Latino Aurora. So this is the census data on Spanish-speaking people in Latino Aurora, and these are all of the Spanish-speaking people that the 1960 census picked up in Aurora. Nobody was registered outside of this central area in Aurora in 1960. So the east side, which becomes one of the most densely populated Latino communities in the state, there's a few folks there. There's some folks on the east side of the river as well, but a relatively small population. Actually, the Aurora Spanish-speaking surname population is less than 1%, right? So these are the folks that are picked up by the census. About 137 people born in Puerto Rico that lived in Aurora in 1960. About 98 people whose parents were born in Puerto Rico. 17 Black Puerto Ricans, right, which the census picked up. Just under 300 people born in Mexico. Now, census data is imperfect, but a few hundred people we're talking about. Now, in 2019, the numbers are dramatically higher, and I'm sure folks are familiar with a lot of these numbers. But today, Aurora is 43% Latino, close to 90,000 residents of Latino descent. In Aurora, close to 90% of those are Mexican, 6% Puerto Rican, and about 1% Central American and 1% South American. So a Mexican heavy, but not exclusively Mexican population that is really large. Okay. So that's kind of a little bit of the bird's eye view of the growth of Latino suburbia. Okay. I want to drill down a little bit to some specific examples of what has happened in Aurora over time.
All of a sudden, it doesn't want to go.
Oh, okay. Sorry about that. So in looking at the history of what I've seen of Latino migration to Aurora, I've seen a few waves. And this is based on research that I've read, but also a little bit research that I've conducted. So I can't take full credit for this because the historians of Latino America have known these kind of waves for a long time. So the earliest wave of Latinx migration to Aurora was in the early 20th century, mostly Mexican workers fleeing the Mexican Revolution. That was true across the United States, particularly in the Southwest. In the 1930s, there obviously was an economic depression. There was a large wave of people who were repatriated, which is kind of a polite word of forced out of the country from places like Aurora, from places like Michigan, from California in the Southwest. Hundreds of thousands of people were forced to return to Mexico, both American citizens and Mexican citizens during the 1930s. So the Mexican population, though it was small in the 20s, diminished in the 1930s. In the 1940s and 50s, and this was true across Latino suburbia and around Chicago, there were large waves of Puerto Rican contract workers who came to places like Waukegan places like working in big mansions in Elgin as domestic workers, and working in Aurora, that were brought to the United States under specific agreements that went to the island. Companies like Chicago Hardware in Waukegan, companies that were looking for cheap domestic workers and other places, went to the island and brought men and women to places like Aurora, places like Elgin, to settle. Because those people were US citizens, Puerto Ricans are US citizens, they did settle. Many of them were not happy with the jobs, the low pay and the difficult conditions they were working in. So they settled out and formed some very important Spanish-speaking, culturally Latino communities that really provided a base, from what I could tell, for subsequent waves of Mexican people. In the 1970s, I call this the Mexicanization of Chicago's suburbs. The Puerto Rican population starts to be overtaken by a much larger Mexican population. As the Mexican population grows in suburbs like Waukegan and Aurora, folks start to get concerned about the quote unquote arrival of illegal aliens. And we'll see that this kind of fear and this concern really affects people in places like Aurora. In the 1980s and the 1990s, the Mexican population in places like Aurora just absolutely skyrockets. Places like, McHenry County, Lake County, Will County, their Latino and particularly Mexican populations grows by 500%, 600%, 700%. In one place in McHenry County, between 1980 and the mid-90s, the Mexican population grew by over 1,000%. So it was more than 10 times larger in the mid-90s than it was in 1980. So the fastest growing places in the state are Latino suburbs like like Aurora. And of course, after 2000, Mexican immigration, particularly now we're seeing, is starting to stall out, and more Central and South Americans are arriving in places like Aurora. So let me give a few examples of some historical moments that I feel like are significant in the development of this community in Aurora. So first of all, I'm not going to talk a lot about this, but the 1920s railroad camps, anybody who's read anything about the history of Hispanic Latino people in Aurora probably knows a little bit about the boxcar camps that were on the outside of the outskirts of Aurora, and there have been some historians that have done some really excellent work on these camps. But I want to jump ahead in time a little bit to the 1940s and 50s. So I have a few images here that I want to show. The first is a report by the Department of Labor in 1955. And what this says is that in the mid-1950s, Puerto Rican people who had been really concentrated in New York City started to be pushed by the Puerto Rican government and the US government to other places. And some of those places are listed here: Aurora, Illinois, Elgin, Joliet, Waukegan, right? They're listed in a report as a site of significant Puerto Rican communities as early as 1955. Okay, so these were those contract workers that were brought from the island to fill labor needs all across greater Chicago. By 1967, the folks who were the descendants, or in some cases, the very same people who were brought or migrated in the 1940s and 50s, started founding organizations. So the Aurora Puerto Rican Cultural Commission was founded in 1967, and other Puerto Rican groups were founded even a little bit earlier in places like Waukegan as the community started to coalesce. By the present day, we can see that the legacy of those contract workers is still present in the Chicago area. So Aurora, Waukegan, Elgin, and Joliet are the largest Puerto Rican communities outside of Chicago today. Now, fast forward a little bit to the 1970s. Now this community has established itself in most Latino suburbs. In the 1960s, the numbers of Puerto Ricans and Mexicans were about the same, but because of conditions in Mexico and immigration policy in the United States, the Mexican population starts to grow in the 1970s. And one kind of interesting window into this moment comes from a commission that's actually very similar to the Aurora Human Relations Commission, but it was a state level commission that was called the Spanish-Speaking People's Commission. That started, the first idea came from Paul Simon in the 1960s, but it was really up and running and really traveling around the state, looking at the condition of Spanish-speaking people all over the state in the 1970s. When they came to Aurora in 1974, and they had a hearing at the Holiday Inn in Aurora, right, in the St. Charles room of the Holiday Inn in Aurora. And when the Spanish-Speaking People's Commission would go to different places, they would have kind of an open town hall and ask people what they wanted to talk about. What was the state of the Spanish-Speaking Commission? And I think that the content of this hearing really tells us a lot about the state of Spanish-speaking people in Aurora in 1974. Every single person that testified in 1974 testified about discrimination, racial discrimination, workplace discrimination, or the lack of resources for Spanish-speaking people in Aurora. Every single person, right? And I included some of the names here, and I'm happy to send out this PowerPoint later because, you know, I'm not from Aurora, and I don't know the oldest families or the people who were around in the 70s, but I'm sure there are some people out there who do. So I wanted to include some of the names, but there was a representative from the Latin Migrant Council of Aurora that said there weren't enough daycare centers for Spanish-speaking children. William Torres, he complained that the Aurora Police Department never hired Puerto Rican officers, even though they had years of experience back in Puerto Rico. Richard Plata complained that there was no way for Spanish-speaking people to engage in voter registration in Aurora. Jesse Garcia complained that the city of Aurora almost never hired anybody who was Spanish-speaking, period, right? And Mary Decker, who's somebody who's very important in this story, she was a Kane County board member. She also complained that she tried to get the city to hire bilingual personnel and was repeatedly rebuffed. So the point here is that discrimination against Spanish-speaking people in 1974 was the exclusive focus of this hearing. And I think that's really telling. So one person that was present at that hearing was a woman named Mary Decker. And I want to talk about her for a moment because she, I feel like, is not only an important person in Aurora, but she's an important person in the history of Latino and Latina people in Illinois, in the Midwest, possibly even the country. So up until recently, most historians of Hispanic people in Illinois believe that a woman named Irene Hernandez was the first county level Latino elected official in the state of Illinois. And when I started to look into the records, I saw Mary Decker mentioned as a Kane County board member, but did not realize that she was actually Mexican American. That's because her birth name was Maria Margarita Rodriguez, but she married a man named Stanley Decker and ended up going by Mary Margaret. She was in fact elected to the Kane County Board in 1972. And based on all of the records that I've had access to and talking to a lot of people, talking to Kane County archivists, talking to former mayor of Aurora, talking to historians, I do believe that Maria Margarita Decker, and actually with a lot of help from Colleen here, Colleen, I think you even found this picture right here. So Colleen was really instrumental in this research. I do believe that Maria Margarita Decker is the first Latino or Latina county level elected official in Illinois history, right? So she was elected 2 years before Irene C. Hernandez was appointed by Mayor Daley in Chicago. And the reason I think this is important is because she was not from Chicago, right? Maria Decker lived most of her life in Aurora, Illinois, right? She was elected to a prominent position, but probably the first in the state of Illinois as a Latino or Latino person being from Aurora, Illinois. So it really points to the significance of this community. The other interesting thing about Mary Decker is that she was very deliberate about running under the name Mary Margaret Decker. and not Maria Margarita Decker. She was a real estate agent. She sold a ton of houses to Spanish-speaking people on the east side of Aurora. People knew her, they loved her in the Spanish-speaking community, but she was not totally sure she could win the support of white voters in Aurora, right? So she decided, she told me this because I did an oral history with her, she decided to get her children, who were very light-skinned kids and very cute, walk them around in the more white neighborhoods of Aurora and introduce herself as Mary Margaret Decker. So, I'm Mary Margaret Decker, can I have your vote? She's very persistent. She is she's like a spark plug of a person, and she was able to win this election with a combination of her, leadership in the Spanish-speaking community and courting the vote of white residents of Aurora.
What year?
This was 1972.
72.
Yeah, so it was a pretty amazing, and I believe, feat that is historic in the history of Illinois. The very following year, Mary Decker was at the center of a firestorm when the Highlight Theater in Aurora was raided by immigration officials. 88, as the newspapers that Colleen tracked down for me, 88 Mexican quote unquote aliens were arrested by immigration officials, but what folks were really upset about was the way that they were treated. This was a theater that played Spanish movies. It was a Sunday. Immigration officials busted in, roughed people up. One man even had his citizenship papers on him and they were torn out of his hands. There were complaints that there were children knocked to the ground. So this became a huge firestorm in Aurora, and at the center of it was the first Hispanic elected official, like prominent elected official, Mary Decker. This is Mary Decker right here in the middle of a meeting at Chapa Real Estate in 1973. The community got together. They held two massive rallies where hundreds of people from Aurora, but also from Chicago, showed up. They invited immigration officials and they demanded that the Mexican community in Aurora be treated with more respect by immigration officials. So this became a huge news event. TV cameras were here. It was written up in most of the major papers. So this story of the rise of an important Latina leader in 1972 Aurora, but also the clampdown by immigration officials around the same time really gives us a window into what was happening in 1970s Aurora. And I'm almost out of time here, but I want to talk about just one more moment that is about 15 years later, which some of you have probably heard of, but it was a strike at the BRK electronics factory in Aurora in 1989. And there's some pictures from the strike. The strike got pretty hot. There were reports that police cars were pelted with eggs, that the managers of BRK were afraid to come outside because this mostly female Puerto Rican and Mexican workforce was really upset, not only at BRK management, but at their union. What these women actually won after being on strike for several days was some basic things like getting their contract translated into Spanish, and regular bathroom breaks and a slight raise. But this became very newsworthy in Aurora in the late 1980s. But the reason I'm sharing this as well is because it really shows that the labor of men and women of Latino descent in Aurora was the central flashpoint in the 1980s and 1990s. Folks came from Puerto Rico, folks came from Mexico, folks came from Central America to Aurora to work, and in large part to work in light manufacturing, right? That work was low paid in places like BRK. People were very injury prone because of the repetitive nature of it. But what it did is it helped those companies accumulate profits, right? And stay competitive in the 1980s and 90s economy. So these Latino immigrants and also Latino US citizens really played a very critical role in the growth of the suburban economy in the 1980s and 90s. And I have a lot more to say about that, but I think I don't want to go too far over time. And finally, I just want to say that, Latinx people in Aurora today and tomorrow. We don't know how the community is going to change, but if we looked at the last 10 years, it's going to continue to grow, right? We know that there's a crisis of, housing in Chicago and housing affordability. We can probably expect that the metropolitan area is going to continue to suburbanize. The community is probably going to grow. But there have been there's been a lot of obstacles, but there's been some significant changes. I watched a few of the videos from Aurora Avanzando, which interviews Latino descended city employees of Aurora, and I couldn't help but recall that 1974 discrimination hearing where folks were saying that the city was refusing to hire anyone Spanish speaking, and now there's enough Spanish speaking employees in the city of Aurora that they can hold multiple talkbacks with those folks, and some very proud Puerto Rican and Mexican folks and folks of other Latino ethnicities who are really trying to advance Aurora. But at the same time, I want to show here, that is a picture of the Elk Grove Village Technology Park. That is a technology park that is the largest in the world. It's the largest industrial park in the world. It's almost exclusively staffed by Latino people. Those Latino people are almost exclusively employed by temporary agencies. So we know that the role of Latino labor in the contemporary economy of the suburbs continues to be really important. So I don't want to go over time. I hope I wasn't too fast or too confusing for folks, but I do want to offer that I hope that this shines a little bit of a light on the recent history of Latinos in Aurora. But we are continuing to collect stories in order to kind of recuperate a lot of this history. So if you have a story and you'd like to be interviewed, we have a website at Chicagolandia oralhistory.org. My email is there. You can contact me by phone. And we have been calling through different requests for interviews, and folks who are selected, we are offering $100 to share your story. Most folks, sharing their story is a personal thing, right? And it's an important thing to share. So we do want to recognize that by compensating people. So if anybody's interested, please reach out, and I'll be happy to talk to you. But kind of one of the big takeaways that I want to leave you all with is that the creation of this history is really not just by people like me who teaches history or studies history for a living. It's all of us together creating together these histories. So I do want to just kind of end right there and open it up if there's anybody here present or anybody on Zoom who would like to share a history of Hispanic or Latino Aurora, or any part of your own personal history that you maybe saw reflected here or maybe didn't see reflected here. We're more than happy to listen to those stories. So thank you so much for
Thank you so much.